Imagine for a second, witnessing something you can't explain. A bizarre light in the sky that appears, quickly streaks across, and then disappears out of sight. Or you saw figures that you can't explain. Or much worse, dreams of abductions that seem so terrifying you would have to believe that they were real. Naturally, you would want to tell someone, anyone who will listen. And above everything, you would want someone to believe you. Then, you're visited by people you don't know, who you can only describe as men wearing dark suits. They ask you what happened, and then begin to threaten you to no end, promising to do terrible things unless you stop telling your story. Then, as quickly as they appear, they're gone, never to be seen again. The truth behind them, and the encounters with the people or beings known only as the Men in Black, are coming up in this week's episode. Stay with us. Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Welcome back to a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. As always, I'm Nick, your host for this week's episode. And on this episode, we're going to discuss the story of the people who have never existed, known only as the Men in Black. Ensure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn down your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone, or maybe they're about to come knocking on your door. Now follow the sound of my voice, and let's get into our story. Beginning in the late 1940s, the United States began a great period of interest in the study of unidentified flying objects. First came the reports, like that of pilot Kenneth Arnold's, that would tear through the national media and capture the attention of the masses. Following this came the incident at Roswell, where it was believed that one of these flying saucers crash-landed in the field of local rancher Mac Brazel. Now, we've previously covered these events in depth during our Chapter 8 of the podcast, so if you aren't familiar with the story, please feel free to listen to that and get a bit more context for this episode. There were also many people who had come forward claiming to have met and had discussions with friendly visitors to the planet. People such as Helen and Betty Mitchell, or Elizabeth Clarer and Buck Nelson, are some of these who have claimed to have had encounters with the entities known as the Greys. Now, these stories vary in degree, from Buck Nelson's trip with the entities beyond the borders of the world to Venus and the Moon. Elizabeth Clarer even claimed to have been visited by these beings since the age of 7 and was the first one to report sexual activity with an extraterrestrial being. All the while, the Mitchell sisters claimed they could communicate with aliens through a device they manufactured and receive transmissions back from those beings to stop all nuclear weapons testing and programs. Now, some of these stories may seem a bit far-fetched to the average listener, but they're certainly worth looking into if you have a genuine interest on the subject. Needless to say, there are many stories from those who have claimed to not only witnessed, but made contact with extraterrestrial beings. They differ, but they do share some similarities with one another. Largely, it's inferred that our planet has been under their watch for some time now. If you look back into times of antiquity, there are a great many references to alien influence. The pyramids, Stonehenge, many things that escape our understanding. The aliens also have a distaste for acts of violence that humans carry out against one another and cause a rift between people. They believe that humanity must unite and see eye to eye before we become the architects of our own destruction. With all of these things and people from all locations and walks of life, there certainly has to be a degree of truth to it all. Many different feelings also come along with this. Fear of the unknown, or even worse, invasion or war. Others have had feelings that extraterrestrial beings might usher humanity into a golden age, one where we expand our reach and influence in the galaxy. They would bring us technology we would never have thought possible. Of course, up to the creation of this podcast, we're still no further along in the fields of human extraterrestrial contact than we were back then. With all of these sightings and reports of contact, there is a genuine degree of innocence, especially from those who want so badly to believe we're not alone. And much like Newton's third law, for every action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction. There are people who actively work against these believers. Those people who chalk all of this up to silliness, hoaxes, and even outright refute them as conspiracy theories, always forgetting that we are but a pale blue dot in the midst of the universe, and we still don't know the boundary of it. Surely, there must be others out there somewhere. The reports of those beings making contact with us is them trying to get us to believe and to listen. But, like the naysayers and conspiracy theorists actively seek to dismiss these claims, there are those who seek to shut them down altogether. These beings have become known as the Men in Black. One of the greatest descriptions of these beings was given by a doctor named Herbert Hopkins from his encounter with them in 1976. This character was as bald as an egg. He didn't have eyebrows or eyelashes. It looked like he had smooth, plastic skin, like a doll, except that it was a dead white color. His lips were a brilliant ruby red, and he spoke in an expressionless, monotone, scanning speech. He constructed no phrases or sentences, just a sequence of words evenly spaced. His voice was completely passive, with no inflection or intonation, as though you were hearing it talk from a machine. Now, this probably isn't the first description to come to mind when you think the Men in Black, and it certainly doesn't portray Will Smith or Tommy Lee Jones. And because of these inhuman qualities, these things become terrifying entities. These Men in Black don't work for an organization whose main goal is to protect Earth. They are menacing, frightening, and they often give off a feeling of being supernatural. Being afraid to come forward about potential contact with alien life is one thing. Fear of being dismissed or laughed at can dissuade a person from wanting to tell their story. But these beings are actively working to silence these storytellers. They arrive after someone has had an experience or during an active UFO or alien investigation. Sometimes they reach out through phone calls or by some other means. but almost always there is a warning to cease any investigation and for the person to outrightly forget what they had seen or experienced. In their more radical methods, they turn up at your home at any hour, dressed entirely in black suits and hats. They have been known both to come by themselves or in groups, and may or may not possess some kind of identification. They use false names to identify themselves and claim that they are from a secret organization that doesn't exist. Infrequently, there have been reports of women in black, but these encounters are very rare. The beings have been said to evolve with the times, both in terms of vehicles they use, their demeanor, and language. They normally arrive when the person who experienced any activity is alone and possibly at their most vulnerable. Although, these things probably don't register with the contactee until much later. They will begin to investigate the person they have come to see, asking questions about their involvement with UFO investigations. Strangely, they are aware of personal details and information, even things that might never have been said or made public. Regardless of any responses or reasoning, the motive is always clear. A stern and extremely forward suggestion is made for the person to forget about anything they encountered or experienced. There are sometimes threats of violence or repercussions, though no reports to this day have made note of any violence actually carried out. If the person was able to recover any debris or artifacts, they are often confiscated, severely inhibiting the credibility of the person's story. Almost always after which they disappear as quickly as they arrived, normally so fast it doesn't seem possible. They leave no evidence of their ever having been present, and only the confusion of the contactee normally is left behind. Truth be told, no one, even those who have been visited by the men in black, know exactly what they are. There is a strangeness about them, some kind of supernatural feeling that really can't be explained. Almost always, they're described as being inhuman, failing to have some of the normal features that humans would. They are normally without lips and speak with no inflection in their voices. There are often different streams of theory for what the men in black truly are. The first theory is that they're aliens, robots, or some other kind of inhuman being, owing to their strange appearance and behaviors. Another is that they're simply government agents who are human. One of the more out there theories, and possibly the most awesome one, is that they're time travelers coming to correct our timeline and to stop humanity from following a certain path in the future. The first appearance of the Men in Black comes from June of 1947, after an event known as the Maury Island Incident. For a bit of background on the incident, 3 men, Harold Dahl, his son, and Fred Chrisman, stated that they witnessed a sort of UFO rendezvous when they were sailing off the coast of Maury Island in Washington. They witnessed, in their words, 6 donut-shaped objects. One of the objects dropped to a height of 1,500 feet and began ejecting some kind of physical material from it, which came in contact with their boat. Unsure of what exactly it was, they made sure to take some of it with them, as they didn't know how anyone could believe them if they didn't. Of course, happening right before this were the reports from Kenneth Arnold, so this story certainly would have also caught national attention, which it did. And word began to get out in the papers. Word had reached Kenneth Arnold about the recovery of things that Dahl and Chrisman had made. He took the recounting of their events at face value and was able to convince a few friends of his in the United States Air Force to look into the case. When the Air Force investigated, they discovered that the recovered material was simply aluminum. This would have been a simple investigation, save for two things. After Dahl had finished speaking to Arnold the morning following the incident, he was approached by what was described as a mysterious stranger wearing a black suit and driving a black sedan. They ended up at a local diner where the man in black spoke to Dahl, recounting the events he witnessed in extremely accurate detail. Later, in Gary Barker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, the man was quoted as saying to Dahl,
"What I have said is proof to you that I know a great deal more about this experience of yours than you will want to believe."
He warned Dahl to forget what happened and that he was to stop speaking about what he had seen. One of the most bizarre things surrounding this event was in reference to the return trip of the investigators. On their way home, the plane carrying those who investigated Dahl and Chrisman mysteriously crashed and both of the men perished. Of course, this would spawn a conspiracy theory saying that everyone involved was being silenced. In separate events, months later, Dahl received a visit from the FBI. The FBI wanted to know a bit more about Dahl's UFO encounter. They received his statements, some of which differed in their telling, and finally closed the case. It was claimed to be a hoax. With this being the first recorded incident of the Men in Black, they wouldn't come again into the public eye until about 10 years later, when the previously mentioned book by Gray Barker was released in 1956. Barker's theories were a large contrast to the Golden Age view after contact that some contactees had actually put forward. There were many tales of people being coerced and threatened into silence. Among these was the story of a Connecticut man and UFO researcher named Dr. Albert Bender. Bender was the founder of an organization known as the International Flying Saucer Bureau, or IFSB for short. This organization was made up of like-minded people from around the world, at its height reaching up to 600 members. The book detailed that Bender and his organization had captured the attention of the Men in Black in 1952. Bender began to be tormented by strange phenomena in his apartment. The smell of sulfur, strange phone calls, obscure health problems, and the feeling that he was constantly being watched all began to permeate his life. He would state that he also experienced hypnosis and levitation. On a creepier note, on one occasion, when he was at a movie theater, he claimed to have witnessed a man with glowing eyes staring at him the entire time he was there. Bender also began experimenting with telepathic communication, which caused a yellow mist to pool in his attic. He would also start receiving telepathic warnings to stop all forms of investigating that he was taking part in. It would be in July of 1953 that Bender would receive his first physical visit from the Men in Black. They appeared looking like clergymen, but wearing hats. They said nothing to him physically and communicated through telepathy. He was told to stop publishing his findings and all of his UFO research altogether. They departed his home, leaving only a trail of yellow smoke in their wake. Bender took this ominous visit to heart. He disbanded the IFSB and ceased all forms of publication. This would last until 1962, when he would again publish more research in the book Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Bender's encounters with the Men in Black may have been a bit shaped by his personal interests, as before UFOs, he had a great interest in the occult and paranormal. After Bender's books were released, the reports of extraterrestrial encounters bringing the Golden Age began to give way to terrifying stories. Those of abduction and the idea that aliens being a space menace rather than friends. After they truly came to the forefront, the reports of men in black became a lot more widespread. To examine this a bit further, we'll discuss some different reports about the men in black from various people who claim to have been visited by them. The first story comes from the encounter of Dr. Herbert Hopkins. One night, Dr. Hopkins received a call from someone who introduced themselves as a UFO activist and wanted to discuss a case. When Dr. Hopkins agreed to meet, it was only a matter of minutes before the person arrived at his door. The caller, Hopkins described as wearing a black suit and tie, bearing an unusual facial appearance with no hair or eyebrows, and was extremely pale. Hopkins's dog also did not take kindly to the visitor. Hopkins witnessed the man touch his mouth and then pull his fingers away. When he did, there was a red substance left on them that he could only describe as resembling lipstick. According to the website The Night Sky, this is an account of how the meeting went. He informed Hopkins that there were 2 coins in his pocket, which was correct, and he asked him to remove one. Hopkins complied and held the coin, a shiny new penny, in the palm of his hand. The man in black told Hopkins to watch the coin closely. After a few moments, the coin took on a silvery appearance and appeared to be going out of focus. Then, it began to fade and eventually disappeared altogether. The man in black informed Hopkins that the coin would never be seen on this plane again. He then inquired as to whether Hopkins was familiar with alleged UFO abductee Barney Hill. Hopkins replied that he had heard of Hill, but was under the impression that he had died in the not-too-distant past. The man in black informed Hopkins that this was correct.
Barney didn't have a heart, just like you no longer have a coin.
The man in black then gently suggested that Hopkins destroy any material he had related to the UFO case. Hopkins didn't want to take any chances. He was very confused and extremely terrified by the encounter. He destroyed everything he had on UFOs and began experiencing trouble with his phone. On a separate occasion, a man named Jim Templeton and his daughter were out one day taking pictures and having a great time. When Jim got his film developed, he was shocked to discover that there was a figure standing behind his daughter in the photo. A figure that he could only describe as a spaceman. When he took the photo, the figure was certainly not there and led him to question what exactly this could be. He returned to the Kodak store and they verified the picture as authentic and the source film was not tampered with. He took the photo to the police in the town of Carlisle, who had a look at it and thought that there was nothing suspicious about it. Eventually, the story leaked to the media and, without any form of doubt, began to draw a good amount of attention. Unfortunately for Jim, this would also attract undesired attention as well. Not long after the story broke, he was visited by 2 men who claimed to be government agents. They offered no form of identification and only went by the names Number 9 and Number 10. They asked Jim to bring them to where the photo was taken and asked him numerous questions about what he saw and other things that happened. Much like he had expressed before, he told them that he didn't actually see the figure at the time of taking the picture. The two agents were notably agitated and immediately left the area, never to be seen again. The being in question, the spaceman, has come to be known as the Solway Firth Spaceman. He has since dismissed the two government agents as frauds. One of the most intriguing stories is that of Paul Miller that comes from the state of North Dakota in November of 1961. One night, Paul and 3 of his friends were returning home to Minot after a hunting trip. Along the dark road they were traveling on, they noticed a strange object appear over their vehicle and land in a field nearby, just off the road. Naturally curious, they slowed down their vehicle and just watched the object. Their first thought was worry. They worried that it might have been a plane that had crashed to the ground. Everything seemed normal until they watched the object disappear before their very eyes. At this point, they had no further desire to stay. They started to drive off when the object appeared again. But this second appearance was different. They watched 2 figures who could only be described as humanoids walk out of the object. They immediately stopped their vehicle. Miller stepped out, aimed his gun at the figures, fired only once, and his shot appeared to wound the figure he fired at. Still afraid, the 4 men got back in the truck and took off. They finally rolled back into town, but something was amiss. Sometime between the incident and when they got back to town, they couldn't account for about 3 hours of time. They talked amongst themselves and tried, as best as they could, to make sense of what happened. They all thought it best not to speak on it or even report what they experienced. Unfortunately, that's not where their story would end. Miller, who worked in an office of the Air Force, arrived to work the next day feeling off. The events from the previous evening certainly didn't sit well with him, but nonetheless, he was going to try going about his day as normally as possible. Not long after he got to work, 3 strange men, all wearing black suits and ties, arrived, looking to have a word with him. They claimed they were from the government, which, being in a building that belonged to the Air Force, wasn't too suspicious. When he asked them for some form of identification, they ignored him. They stated to him something to the effect of, "We hope you're telling the truth," which he knew was about the events of the previous evening. A cold chill ran down his spine. How could they possibly know about what happened? Everyone in that vehicle was sworn to secrecy, and he hadn't reported anything himself. The men in black would claim that they possessed a report, which Miller knew was impossible. Miller, however, wouldn't be able to call their bluff. They knew everything about him, who he was, where he worked. There was no escaping them. They became even more intimidating and began probing him with questions about the incident. Miller knew he could respond, but felt as though they already knew the answers, so he simply couldn't lie his way out of the interrogation. Like all other times, as quick as they arrived, they left. Miller wouldn't speak of the incident for several years before finally talking to investigators. The most recent reported encounter, and the one with actual evidence of the men in black, comes from 2008. The manager of the Sheraton Fallsview Hotel in Niagara Falls, New York, by the name of Shane Sovar, and one of his security guards claimed to have witnessed a UFO just outside the window of their hotel. They reported the encounter to a UFO investigation team who looked further into the sighting. 3 weeks after this, 3 members of Sovar's hotel staff claimed that 3 men in black suits visited the hotel, terrifying the staff in the process. They were looking for Sovar and the security guard who witnessed the UFO, but they were not at the hotel during the time in which the men in black arrived. The staff would describe them similarly to Dr. Hopkins's account. No facial hair, no eyebrows, eyelashes, nothing. One of the staff that spoke to them said they looked as though they were wearing wigs that attached to their hats and almost appeared blue in color. The staff member claimed that she believed they knew what she was thinking. Another thing she reported about them was that they never even blinked once during their entire encounter. There is a lot of suspicion about this encounter, and I'll put a link to the video showing the men in black coming into the lobby in the show notes so you can see for yourselves. It remains to be seen if any of these reported meetings were ever true. The reports of men wearing black suits who have claimed to be government agents could always be possible. In the 1950s, there was an Air Force program that looked into the flying saucer phenomena known as Project Blue Book. Government officials have been known in the past to intimidate people, and it would be realistically possible for anyone to pose as these individuals, especially when you consider that they never produce any form of identification or give their names. Another theory that circulates is that the existence of the men in black and the way they appear can often describe the way people are encountered by Lucifer. This theory was proposed by ufologist James Lewis in his book, The Gods Have Landed: New Religions from Other Worlds. He goes on to state, they have parallels to strange people who come in contact with monsters. Pierre Rojevitz sees both resemblances and differences between the men in black and more traditional appearances of the devil. He raised the question whether the visits of the men in black can, at times at least, be considered a kind of psychological drama. So, what are you left to do if you encounter the men in black? Through the stories that have been told, there isn't very much. They know who you are, where you live, and what you think. They know about your encounters, your stories, and what happened. It seems best to simply have their discussion and answer their questions, for they'll soon be gone. Their threats seem largely idle, and none of the purported violence has ever been carried out. They are menacing, inhuman figures whose sole purpose is to terrorize their victims into absolute silence. One cannot be certain if these are purely imaginative or if they really exist, but nonetheless, I hope you've enjoyed my research and investigation into the men in black, and I wonder who that could be.
Good evening, sir. We would like to speak with you, and we certainly hope you'll tell the truth.
If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story and weren't silenced by the men in black. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about this podcast and expanded things from this episode, please remember to visit our socials, which can be accessed through the link tree in the show notes. Before you go, remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the exciting stories to come. And remember to come back next week for the official start of October's spooky season slate and the amazing episodes I have waiting for you. And to kick things off, we'll start with the history of Halloween and hear the reading of a truly terrifying story to get us in the spooky mood. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.